I was told to stand near the back of the room, behind marble and flowers and people who mattered more. My wife leaned in close and told me to stay quiet, to not embarrass her tonight, her voice calm and practiced, like this instruction had been rehearsed before. The gala in Rockford was full of polished shoes and confident laughter, the kind that assumes ownership. I adjusted my jacket and obeyed, because obedience had become easier than explaining myself, easier than asking why I was always asked to disappear. The lights were warm and unforgiving, reflecting off glass and silver. I could see her moving through the crowd, shaking hands and smiling with her professional smile, the one that never reached home. I told myself this was normal, that supporting meant stepping back. Even when the room felt like it was closing around me, I stayed where I was placed, half hidden by a column that looked imported and expensive, watching executives cluster like birds, waiting for approval. The energy shifted when the new owner arrived. People straightened and whispered titles. I expected her to stop at the center, to accept praise and attention. Instead, she walked past them all, heels steady, eyes searching. The room seemed to narrow as she moved. And then she was in front of me, taking my hands without hesitation. Like she knew exactly where to find them. She noticed the scar on my wrist, the one I stopped explaining years ago. Her fingers paused there, gentle and certain. She said she had been looking for me for 28 years. And the noise of the room fell away. Behind us, I heard a sharp sound. Glass breaking against stone. My wife had dropped her drink. Shock finally breaking through her control. No one laughed, no one spoke. The owner kept her focus on me, not asking permission, not offering explanation, just presence. I felt exposed and strangely solid at the same time, like something buried had been recognized. My wife rushed forward, apologizing to everyone but me, calling my name like a warning, telling me I was confused. I did not answer, because for the first time in a long while, I was not. The owner thanked her politely and continued speaking to me, asking how my wrist healed, asking about my life here. Questions no one else had thought to ask. The room watched, power rearranging itself quietly. I realized then that embarrassment was not standing in the back. Embarrassment was being seen for who you were, and fearing what that visibility might cost. As I stood there, hands still held, I understood that the night was not about a gala. It was about a choice that had already been made, and it was not hers anymore. The owner stayed beside me as the room recovered its breath. People leaned closer, pretending not to stare. My wife hovered with a smile stretched thin, trying to reclaim control without making a scene. The owner introduced herself simply, no titles, no ceremony, as if she belonged anywhere she stood. She asked if I could step aside with her. Not a request really, more like an assumption. I felt my wife's hand touch my arm, light but urgent. She said my name again, softer now. A reminder of rules we never wrote down. I followed the owner anyway, because something in her certainty felt older than permission. We moved toward a quieter edge of the hall, where the music thinned and conversations lost their edge. She asked if I remembered a summer in Rockford, when the stadium lights felt brighter than the future. I nodded before I could stop myself, memory answering faster than caution. She told me she had rehearsed this moment and still felt unprepared, that she bought the company knowing I might be here, or knowing I might not. Either way, she needed to look. She said time does not erase recognition. It only tests it. I listened as the gala continued around us, applause breaking out for reasons that suddenly felt irrelevant. My wife stood frozen across the room, surrounded by colleagues who sensed something was wrong but did not yet understand what. The owner asked about the scar again. I told her it came from a job site accident years after baseball ended. A small detail, but her eyes sharpened, like she was assembling a picture that had been waiting for the last piece. She said she remembered my wrist wrapped in tape after a game. Remembered telling a roommate she would marry me someday. A reckless certainty spoken into a cheap apartment with bad plumbing and big dreams. We did not talk long, not really, just enough for the air between us to feel real. She said she did not want to make the night about the past, but she wanted me to know the present had room for truth. She pressed a card into my hand, folded once, like something meant to be private. She said it was not about money, it was about clarity. Then she excused herself with a nod that sent people scrambling back into position. My wife finally approached, laughing too loudly, apologizing again, telling the owner I was easily confused in crowds like this. I watched the owner look at her, not unkindly, just observant. Then she walked away without responding. The silence she left behind was heavier than any insult. My wife turned on me, asking what I had said. Asking what I had done, I told her nothing, which was true. I had only stood where I was, and for the first time, someone else had met me there. She suggested a diner the next morning. Not a place that tried to impress, just somewhere with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that kept refilling. I arrived early out of habit, watching trucks pass and people start their shifts. When she walked in, there was no hesitation, no performance. She sat across from me like time had folded instead of stretched. We talked slowly, leaving space between sentences. She said she remembered 1995 clearly, remembered the way Rockford felt when baseball still seemed like a promise. She said she wrote letters after she moved, then called, then stopped when nothing came back. Not angry, just confused. I told her about my father getting sick, the bills stacking faster than wins, the choice to step away quietly. I told her I never got the letters, never heard the messages, that I thought she moved on. The way people with options do, she listened without interrupting. The way people do when they are not waiting to defend themselves. She said memory is strange. It preserves intention better than outcome. She said she never forgot me, even when her life grew louder and more complex. She asked about the years in between, not as an audit, but as curiosity. I told her about becoming a union electrician, about learning to work with my hands in ways that paid steadily, about meeting my wife and building something that looked stable from the outside. I did not say happy. She did not ask. She noticed the pauses, the way certain years blurred together when spoken aloud. She said sometimes absence is not distance. It is obstruction. The word landed heavier than I expected, because it gave shape to something I had never named. When we stood to leave, she did not make promises. She did not suggest rewriting anything. She just said people become who they need to survive. And sometimes they forget who they were before that need took over. She handed me another card. Different this time, with a name and number. She said this person helped her understand things when her own life felt misaligned. She said clarity is quieter than accusation, and stronger than denial. Outside the diner, the air felt sharper, like a season changing without warning. I drove home thinking about letters that never arrived, about choices I thought were mine, about how easy it is to believe a story when it is repeated gently enough. I did not feel angry. I felt alert, like someone who just realized the map they trusted might have been edited, and that the original was still out there, waiting to be unfolded. I did not call the number right away. I let it sit on the kitchen counter for 2 days, partially hidden under mail I had stopped opening carefully. My wife moved through the house with her usual efficiency, asking surface questions, offering surface answers. I watched the rhythm we had built together, noticing how often it required me to not look too closely. When I finally made the call, it was from my truck, parked 2 blocks away. The voice on the other end was calm and unhurried. She said she worked with patterns, not accusations. And that clarity often begins with noticing what is missing, not what is wrong. We set a meeting for the following week. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. which somehow made it feel more serious. Before that meeting, I started paying attention in small ways. I noticed I could not remember the last time I had seen a paper statement for my retirement accounts. I remembered a binder I used to keep on a shelf in the office. Labeled and neat, I went looking for it one evening while my wife showered. The shelf was clean, reorganized, improved. The binder was gone. I asked casually later, keeping my tone light. She smiled and said everything was online now. That paper was outdated. That I worried too much about things I did not understand. The words were familiar, soothing on the surface. Dismissive underneath, I nodded. Because that was the role I had learned, but something had shifted. The card in my pocket felt heavier than it should have. At the meeting, the accountant did not ask about my wife. She asked about my habits. How often I checked accounts, who handled the mail, whether I had ever signed anything without reading it fully. There was no judgment in her questions, just sequence. She explained how easily information could be redirected when one person controlled the flow. How authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply replaces memory. She said clarity does not arrive all at once. It arrives in confirmations. Small and undeniable. As I left her office, I sat in my truck again, hands on the wheel, feeling the strange relief that comes when confusion starts to organize itself. I was not uncovering betrayal yet. Not officially, but I was learning where to look. And more importantly, where I had been trained not to look at all. Once I started looking, absence became louder than presence. I checked drawers and files that used to hold records, finding only curated order, the kind designed to reassure rather than inform. I asked again about the retirement binder, this time less casual. My wife sighed like a teacher correcting a slow student. She said I was mixing things up, that the accounts were consolidated. That numbers had always made me anxious. She reminded me how busy she was, how much she handled for both of us. The implication was clear. Trust is easier than understanding. I nodded again, but the nod felt different now. It was a pause, not agreement. I went to the credit union the next day under the excuse of updating contact information. The woman at the desk pulled up my file and frowned slightly. A professional pause. She asked if I still wanted statements sent to the PO box. I told her I did not have a PO box. She turned the screen toward me, showing an address change from 6 months earlier, authorized under a power of attorney. My name signed in a version that looked almost right. Almost like mine, my chest tightened, not with panic, but with focus. I asked for copies. She hesitated, then complied, explaining policies without meeting my eyes. I thanked her and walked out into the cold. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than any accusation. That evening, I placed the papers on the kitchen table, aligned carefully. My wife glanced at them and laughed, softly, like I had brought home something trivial. She said I was getting confused again. That stress does that to people my age. She reached for the papers, and I stopped her. Gently, which surprised us both, I said I just wanted to understand. She leaned back and crossed her arms, irritation slipping through her calm. She said I always did this, turned nothing into something. She said I was embarrassing her now, even here. I realized then how often embarrassment had been used as a leash, how often confusion had been assigned to me like a diagnosis. I gathered the papers and put them away without another word, because the evidence did not need defending. It only needed time, and for the first time, time was finally on my side. The next step was quieter and lonelier. I went to the public library because it was the last place untouched by shared passwords and polite surveillance. I sat at a terminal with sticky keys and a flickering screen, resetting access to an old email account I had not opened in years. The recovery questions felt like archaeology, past jobs, old streets. Answers I remembered because no one else had needed them. When the inbox finally loaded, it did not feel dramatic. Just heavy. Messages stacked in orderly rows. Automated notices from financial institutions. Confirmations of address changes, alerts about beneficiary updates. Each one stamped with dates I could not ignore. 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a pattern forming without emotion. I forwarded everything to a flash drive. Methodical and slow because speed invites mistakes. And mistakes are expensive. I met the attorney 2 days later. Recommended quietly, not advertised. Her office was small and precise. Like a place where words were chosen carefully. She reviewed the documents without commentary at first, just nodding at intervals. Then she looked at me and said I did not need to confront anyone yet. She said confrontation warrants and warnings destroy leverage. She explained how authority often collapses when it is exposed to sequence. Not accusation. Dates matter. Signatures matter. Silence matters most. She said the power of attorney could be challenged, but timing would determine whether it was dismissed or punished. She asked if my wife held any public role tied to ethics or compliance. I answered honestly and watched her expression sharpen slightly. Not with excitement, but with strategy, at home that night. I watched my wife prepare for an upcoming awards dinner, rehearsing lines in the mirror, adjusting posture, refining credibility. She spoke about leadership and transparency with practiced warmth. I listened from the doorway, unseen, holding a copy of the document she believed I could not read. I realized then that the story she told the world depended on my silence. Not my support, and silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes something else entirely. I placed the papers back in their folder and slid it into the truck under the spare tire. Not hidden, just positioned, like everything else I was finally learning to do. There was no anger in me, no urge to expose her immediately. Only a growing certainty that truth did not need volume. It needed placement, and when it arrived, it would not ask for permission to be believed. I stopped speaking unless necessary, not out of fear, but out of discipline. The house grew quieter as I withdrew from small debates and corrections. My wife filled the space with updates about her work, her schedule tightening around the upcoming ethics dinner. She practiced humility like a skill. I listened like an archivist, noting phrases, timing, confidence, because consistency tells you where pressure will break. I spent evenings in the truck again, reviewing documents under the dome light, organizing them into order, not by emotion, but by sequence, signature, authorization. Each page another piece of a story that no longer relied on my memory. I learned quickly that proof does not argue, it waits. I returned to the accountant with the emails and bank records. She traced flows with a pencil, mapping redirections and consolidations, explaining how control is often disguised as efficiency, how spouses are trusted by default, and how that trust can be converted quietly into authority. She showed me where the changes benefited one path and erased another, where beneficiaries shifted without notification, where access narrowed until only one person could see the full picture. She said this was not chaos, it was design. The word landed without drama because it fit too well. She prepared packets, clean and factual, meant for people who understood liability better than sentiment. She said boards respond to risk faster than outrage, and compliance committees respond fastest of all. The attorney handled the rest with distance and precision. Disclosures submitted without names attached at first. Timelines laid out without commentary. Enough to trigger review, not enough to warn. I signed where instructed, read everything twice, and waited. The hardest part was living normally while knowing what was already in motion. My wife laughed at dinner, planned outfits, complained about incompetent subordinates. She told me the dinner would be important for her visibility, that she needed me there but unobtrusive. The phrasing almost made me smile. I agreed, calmly, because agreement costs nothing when outcomes are already set as the date approached. I felt no rush, no triumph, only steadiness, like standing on ground that had finally stopped shifting beneath my feet. The attorney called 3 days before the dinner, her voice unchanged. She said the audit committee had acknowledged receipt, that timelines had been verified independently, that no one had contacted my wife yet, which meant the process was working. She reminded me again that silence was not weakness, it was containment. She said people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are untouchable, and that belief was still intact. I thanked her and went back to work, pulling wire and checking panels, grounding myself in tasks that required accuracy, the kind where mistakes show immediately. I thought about how different that was from authority, where errors can sit unseen for years, protected by confidence and reputation at home. My wife became sharper as the dinner approached, correcting small things, managing optics, reminding me how to behave. She laid out my suit and told me where to stand, who to speak to briefly, who to avoid. The instructions sounded familiar, almost comforting in their predictability. I followed them without resistance, because resistance would have changed the temperature. And temperature changes alert people who think they control the room. I noticed how often she used the word confused when describing others, a casual dismissal, a way to flatten disagreement. I wondered how many people had accepted that label quietly, the way I once had. The night before the dinner, I slept without trouble, which surprised me. There were no racing thoughts, no imagined speeches, no rehearsed confrontations. Everything that mattered had already been submitted, documented, verified. My role was no longer to convince, only to exist. I understood then what precision over noise really meant. It meant letting systems do what they were designed to do. When given clean information, it meant trusting process instead of impulse. In the morning, as I buttoned my shirt, I caught my reflection and saw someone steadier than I remembered being. Not younger, not braver, just clearer. The kind of clarity that does not announce itself, but when it enters a room, it changes the weight of every word spoken after it. The dinner unfolded exactly as planned. Not my plan, hers. The room arranged for admiration and reinforcement. Tables aligned toward the stage, lighting warm and flattering. My wife moved through it with practiced ease, greeting board members and donors. Reminding them of shared values, I stayed where I was directed, near the edge, visible but insignificant. The speech began with applause, the familiar language of ethics and leadership flowing smoothly. Every phrase delivered with confidence. I listened without reacting, because reaction would have suggested uncertainty, and I had none left halfway through her remarks. A board member stood, not abruptly, just deliberately. He thanked her and said the committee needed to address a compliance matter before proceeding. The room shifted, polite confusion rippling outward. My wife paused, smiled, and laughed lightly, suggesting it could wait. The board member did not sit. Another joined him. A screen behind the stage lit up, displaying timelines and documents. Clean and impersonal, signatures enlarged for clarity. Beneficiary changes highlighted. My wife turned and saw them, the color draining slowly from her face. Not panic yet, just calculation failing to keep pace. She looked toward me instinctively, searching for confusion, for the familiar weakness she could name and control. She said my name into the microphone, lightly, almost kindly. She told the room I sometimes misunderstood paperwork. That stress made me imagine things. I stood then, calmly, because the moment required presence, not volume. I said I was not confused. I was informed, my voice carried without effort. Because the room had already decided to listen, the board members nodded. Security approached the stage with professionalism, not urgency. My wife was escorted away as the screen continued to display facts without commentary. The applause did not return, but something else replaced it. Recognition. As I sat back down, I felt no satisfaction, only completion. Like closing a file that had been open far too long. The consequences arrived quietly, not all at once, but steadily, like mail delivered to the correct address again. My wife lost her position within weeks, the explanation brief and procedural. Ethics violations, breach of fiduciary duty, termination effective immediately. There was no public apology, no spectacle, just absence where authority used to be. The power of attorney was voided, the beneficiary changes reversed. My retirement accounts restored to their original structure. Numbers aligning with records I finally recognized as mine. I signed documents with care, reading every line, asking questions without apology, because clarity had taught me that understanding is not arrogance. It is maintenance. I moved out of the house we curated for appearances. Not out of anger, but necessity. Staying would have required pretending nothing had changed. I chose a small apartment with light that stayed consistent throughout the day. No dramatic views, no statements, just space that belonged to me. I set up my chair by the window and let evenings arrive without commentary. I cooked simply, slept deeply, and noticed how little explanation my life required when it was no longer being managed. People asked how I was doing. I said steady, because that was the truest word I had. I met Eleanor for coffee sometimes. Not to revisit what was lost, but to acknowledge what was found. The conversations were unhurried, present, free of correction. We talked about work, about aging parents, about how paths bend without asking permission. At 57, I understood I was not starting over. I was reclaiming something interrupted. Not a career or a romance, but authorship. I had learned that patience outlasts manipulation. Silence outperforms accusation, and evidence speaks in rooms where emotion never will. As I walked home one evening, keys in hand, I felt no need to look back, because nothing behind me was unfinished, and everything ahead of me finally felt like it belonged to my name.